Thank you very much for coming to actually close the Critical Mobilities Research Program for this year, Kellee. I will try to be very brief in introducing you. Kellee is a tourism studies scholar who co-chairs the Critical Tourism Studies Network. He's executive board member of the Tourism Education Futures Initiative, and also he serves on the editorial board of several journals, including the Annals of Tourism Research. She does some very interesting work. I've been reading carefully. And she works on questions of morality and ethics in tourism. Also epistemological and pedagogical issues in tourism studies. And she employs humanist philosophy to think about questions of ideology, production, and meaning-making. And today she will share some reflections from her new research on how sensory experiences of sites of environmental destruction can make us understand loss and responsibility in more helpful ways in the perhaps too late tourism, as she calls it. And the title of her presentation is Unlonely Planet, Entangling for Good in Tourism, Nature, Cultures. So, Kellee, on to you now.
Thanks so much. Can everybody hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Fabulous. I always have to check that with the technology. So thank you so much. A special thank you to Rodanti for inviting me. This is really a wonderful opportunity to be with you all today. And I would like to extend a thank you for everybody who has logged in and is joining me today. And also special thanks for anybody who's watching this on video. That's very kind of you to go and download after the fact. And I'm glad that you're part of the conversation too. I'd like to start out by acknowledging the land under my feet right now. I'm coming to you today from Shutmakulu, which is the beautiful traditional territory of the Shutmak people in the western part of Turtle Island. And I'm so grateful for their hospitality and for their stewardship of this land from time immemorial. I also need to make a couple of other things before I start. I have had some serious help in chewing through different sections of ideas that are part of what I'm going to share with you today. First of all, from Brian Grimwood and Chris Hurst, who've helped me think about the notion of enchantment and helped me chew through that material. And then especially to my co-researcher and husband, David Hill, who is undertaking this fieldwork with me on the Salton Sea. He's a scientist, and we're really doing a multidisciplinary endeavor. And he has been a tremendous source of help throughout this process and as the research carries on. So thank you all. I'm going to talk for 45 minutes. I've clocked it in at just about that so that we have lots of time for discussion. And rather than talking, technically, I'm going to read to you. I get very, very nervous doing things with technology. I feel much more comfortable in person. And I love that technology lets us be together all over the world, but I'm not so savvy at it. I'm not so smooth with the text. So I do get very nervous about that. And I think in order to try to keep things smooth for you, I'm gonna read you a story so you can think about it in that sense and just kind of relax and have a little story time with me this morning. I say morning, it's afternoon for many of you. It's 8 a.m. for me on the West Coast. So definitely do my best to get the caffeine going for you. Okay, so here we go for some story time. In 2019, before anyone knew the global pandemic would crater the tourism industry, less than a year later, Luxury Travel magazine published a feature titled Last Chance Tourism, 11 Places to Visit Before They Disappear, highlighting everything from the dying polar bears of the Arctic to the sinking islands of the Seychelles to the Italian food and wine scene threatened by climate-induced agricultural changes. The article connects readers with the resources they need to pack a suitcase, grab a camera, and head to one of these amazing destinations before they disappear. In my time with you today, I'd like to consider sites where that last chance has already been missed. Sites where it's now too late for tourism, at least of any sort luxury magazines would choose to advertise. Sorry, my PowerPoint doesn't seem to want to let me advance it. There we go. In the Southern California desert, south of Joshua Tree National Park and north of the Mexican border, there is a depression that has been filled and emptied of water many times over thousands of years. It's called the Salton Sink. Each time the Colorado River would overflow its banks, the bottom of the sink would fill with water. It would fill for about 20 years and then take about 60 years to evaporate. Ancestors of the Papuan people used this water body for fishing and bird hunting and would move up and down between the water and the mountains as the shoreline surged and ebbed. When colonial settlers explored the area, the sink was dry. And you can see from this image at the bottom, the arrows, the way the Colorado River kind of ordinarily goes down to the Baja Gulf, but occasionally drains instead into this Salton Sink. This was in the days of the railroads, which by 1870 had connected the eastern United States with California. As compensation for this technological feat, the railways were given an enormous amount of land, 183 million acres, in the western US from the public domain. Much of this land had a semi-arid or desert climate and was unsuitable for farming. To sell this land, the railway companies spent immense sums of money on advertising to convince people to move westward, leaving the cities and agricultural areas that were reminiscent of Europe to populate the American West. This boosterism and the hope of land ownership by poor Americans and the increasing tide of immigrants from Europe was too great for the voices of scientists such as John Wesley Powell and early settlers who warned that the land was inhospitable. The boosters also resorted to claims based in social Darwinism that those who could not build a better life for themselves in the arid West did not work hard enough. Although the boosterism was initiated by the railways to sell land, it also benefited others who acquired vast swaths of land for the US government through legitimate and sometimes fraudulent means. The Salton Sea exists in what is currently called the Imperial Valley, a name coined in 1900 as an early instance of civic branding to encourage settlement of the area, because I guess nobody wanted to move to a place called the Salton Sink. This area is part of a tectonic pull-apart basin and was once part of the Gulf of California. The Colorado River, which flows into the Gulf of California, deposited sediments that over time cut the Imperial Valley off from the main body of the Gulf of California, although the geological records suggest that the Colorado River periodically changed course to flow through the Imperial Valley before moving back eastward to the channel it occupies today. The alluvial fan of the Colorado continued to extend southward, pushing the northern coast of the Gulf of California to its present-day location and leaving behind the Imperial Valley. You can see here at the bottom of the slide, kind of the turquoise area, is the river delta. So you can see the sediment and the distance now from the Salton Sea up at the top down to the Gulf of California. Much of the bottom land of the Imperial Valley is below sea level, and at the lowest point, the Salton Sink sits approximately 80 meters below sea level. The climate in the area is categorized as tropical and subtropical desert. Temperatures in the valley range from -8 to 49 degrees Celsius, and average rainfall is only 86 millimeters. It would seem like a ludicrous notion to build a farming community in this environment, but because it's bathed in sunshine and has fertile soil due to its alluvial origin, folks got the idea to try. Agriculture in the Imperial Valley was first envisioned in the early 1850s by Professor W.P. Blake. Professor Blake, who was surveying the area for the US government to identify a railway route to the Pacific, realized that because the valley bottom was below sea level, water could be diverted from the Colorado River and would flow by gravity into the Imperial Valley. His dream became a reality in 1901 when the California Development Company built the Alamo Canal, which carried water from the Colorado River to the Imperial Valley and received rights to the land from the federal government in return. The sediment that created the Imperial Valley, however, doomed the Alamo Canal. At the time the Alamo was built, it was estimated by the US Geological Service that the Colorado River moved approximately 160 million tons of sediment annually past the canal inlet. This sediment entered the canal, which had to be dredged to keep the water flowing. In 1904, it became obvious that dredging alone was not going to be sufficient to maintain the canal, and a new solution, which involved cutting a new canal entrance downstream of the original entrance, was necessary. This new canal entrance could be used as a water gauge and waste gate to flush sediment from the upper part of the canal during times of high river flow, or as a backup entrance should the main entrance become unusable due to sedimentation. The secondary entrance, however, was not fitted with a gate for expediency. Basically, they wanted to avoid the cost and regulatory complexity of putting a gate on. The winter of 1905 brought extreme flooding to the Colorado River, and while a gate at the main entrance to the Alamo Canal withstood the force of these floodwaters, an improvised plug made of pilings, rocks, and dirt could not keep the Colorado River from reaching the Alamo Canal. Changing its course to flow into the Imperial Valley and discharging over 2,800 cubic feet of water per second into the Salton Sea. It took 2 years and the entire resources of one of the most powerful industries of the Gilded Age, the Southern Pacific Railroad, to close the breach and return the Colorado River to its channel, leaving behind a great freshwater lake, the Salton Sea, in the Imperial Valley. Today, irrigation water flows from the Colorado River to the Imperial Valley through a new canal, the All-American Canal, and the Salton Sea continues to quietly evaporate in the Southern California sun. The Salton Sea occupies an interreg basin, meaning there's no outflow. The only ways water can leave the lake is by groundwater infiltration or evaporation. It's not actually a sea, it's really just a big puddle. Because the area receives very little rain, the major source of inflow to the lake is agricultural runoff, which contains salt, which occurs naturally in the soil, and fertilizer dissolved in it. At first, the volume of fresh water contained in the lake was sufficient to dilute these wastes, and for a time, the Salton Sea became a glamorous destination, an oasis in the desert, where the Hollywood jet set of the 1950s and 60s came to play. Frank Sinatra was there, the Beach Boys came to water ski, land development reached frenzy. Legend has it that planes flew prospective buyers over the sea and sold them real estate before they landed, but I haven't been able to verify that one. But over time, evaporation and to a small extent water-conserving irrigation practices concentrated the wastes in the water. Today, the Salton Sea is saltier than the ocean, but more troubling is the impact of the fertilizers on water quality. These fertilizers promote algae blooms. When these algae die, they are consumed first by aerobic bacteria, which use up all the oxygen dissolved in the water, killing aerobic aquatic life, leading to more biological material for decomposition. Anoxic decomposition of organisms generates methane and hydrogen sulfide, the former of which is a potent greenhouse gas, and the second of which is toxic in high concentration and smells like rotten eggs. Some of the algae that have bloomed in the Salton Sea have been found to be toxic blue-green algae, which threaten animals who come in contact with the water. The drying up of the Salton Sea also exposes the dry lake bed, which is composed of alkali salt and dust. The strong winds, which the Imperial Valley is famous for, send the alkali salt and dust airborne, which can cause respiratory disease in those who inhale it. We first went to the sea on our honeymoon in 2005. I was fascinated by the idea that a big body of water, now saltier than the ocean, lower than the ocean, in the middle of the Southern California desert. It must have been 45 degrees out. I convinced my husband we had to go in. There were dead fish on the shore. The water was comfy and warm and turned my jewelry brown. A very large bird swam near. I was charmed, but it wanted to be our friend. My husband was more suspicious of its motives. We didn't go back until last year, even though we've been in the nearby Mojave lots over the last 16 summers. When we pulled into the visitor center parking lot, there were hastily posted signs warning against swimming. There had been an explosion of blue-green algae, filling the cyanotoxins. There were news reports that a dog had died after going in the water. The park ranger reiterated the warnings, and I looked wistfully at the water. It's hard not to put your feet in something you love, and I love every last inch of California desert. When we'd been there in 2005, there had been dead fish washed up all over the beach. That problem seemed to have cleared up. Maybe there were no fish left to be dead. A man sat in his car with all the doors blown open, talking on his cell. Everything has changed now. We drove down the road to Bombay Beach. We let the dogs out on the sand where the sea had taken back a third of the town during a hurricane in '77. The heat was searing, so we gave them the first crack of the drinking water, figuring we at least weren't wearing fur coats. We wandered quietly through the art installations on the beach. The town is basically a giant outdoor hippie art gallery these days, in keeping with the desert decay aesthetic the area is famous for, with the nearby sites of Slab City, East Jesus, and Salvation Mountain. I prayed at the Chapel of Rocks in the sand. Signs read, "Bring us back and save our sea." There was a house for sale for $69,000 on Zillow. We drove past the bird sanctuary at the southern tip. Sonny Bono worked so hard to preserve it. Up the other side was Salton City. The bones were all there: water, sewer, street signs laid on a grid, running up the center that broke like a symmetrical wave, rolling back around away from the shore on each side. It had to name an awful lot of streets at once. The names Sea Garden, Shore Gem, made it seem as though someone had had a hat of ocean-themed nouns and one of adjectives and proceeded to draw it random. A handful of houses had manifested on what must have been hundreds of lots. We stopped at the one restaurant left on the water, a burger joint called Johnson's Landing. It was their last day of the season in late May, before the smiting heat of the summer rolled in and closed everything down. The area is popular with paragliders, but that day a handful of folks were driving pickup trucks too fast on the beach, and the bartender was not amused. "Can you swim in it?" I asked of the sea. I guess you could if you wanted to, he said, like it was something he'd never imagined anyone asking. I guess he hadn't heard about the dead dog. Unable to be enjoyed as a public water recreation space, its birdwatching community weary of the stench and toxic dust that may blow up under their binoculars on any given day, today's Salton Sea is an ecotourism destination approached predominantly through the apocalyptic gaze. Google the sea and you'll get tons of hits, leading to popular media descriptions of the site and the experience of road tripping there. There is a certain structure to these accounts. The story of the Salton Sea's accidental creation, followed by talk of its glory days, but sometimes with a knowing tone of foreshadowing, like in the horror movies when you see the guy with the knife before the protagonist does. Like this place was always prefigured to be a site of disaster. Then comes the fall from what was never going to be a lasting peace. Talk turns to the algal blooms. Okay, so here's a 6-minute video for you showing you what I mean when I say that popular representations of this site tend to proceed through the apocalyptic gaze.
I'll probably never walk on Mars either. The closest I'm likely to get to another world are the deserts of California. I love the desert. The alienness of its vast empty spaces, its stark desolation, beautiful and vaguely menacing. How the endless horizon both swallows you up and scales you down, making all human endeavor seem almost comfortingly trivial. My favorite part of the desert is a place not a lot of people know about. It's a land of extremes and contrasts, where sublime landscapes like this are framed against scenes of the apocalypse come early, like this. It's called the Salton Sea. It's the largest body of water in California, and it's not even supposed to be there. At the turn of the last century, an engineering screw-up of epic proportions diverted the Colorado River into one of the lowest, hottest land basins in the United States. It took 2 years to stem the tide, and when the flooding finally stopped, 350 square miles of desert lay underwater. Everyone assumed the giant inland sea they had created by accident would just dry up, but when it didn't, real estate developers tried to turn an ecological disaster into an opportunity.
Here is truly a miracle in the desert, a whole new outlet for the crowded millions in big cities, a Palm Springs with water. Here is where you can find the good life in the sun. Today, the Salton Riviera, beside the blue Salton Sea, is the place for you to take charge of your future. You can come as you are, no reservations required. Enjoy life at the Riviera.
For a while, it really did seem like a miracle. Tourists flocked to a place that had once been unforgiving desert. People bought homes, built schools, restaurants, yacht clubs. But then the sea turned on them. Over the years, its water, fed only by agricultural runoff, became saltier than the ocean. Botulism poisoning killed millions of fish, and massive die-offs during the height of 120-degree summers made the air almost unbreathable. The sea began to flood unpredictably. Tourists fled. Boom towns turned into ghost towns. Today, what remains is a landscape out of science fiction. Gridded streets, every one of them named, still waiting for neighborhoods that never arrived. Beaches made not of shell or sand, but of the pulverized skeletons of uncountable millions of fish. Houses half tumbled into toxic-looking pits. I go there to catch glimpses of what the world will look like without us. Here are some of the things I found. Incrustations of cobwebs and rust, made uninhabitable by unexploded bombs. Ominous warnings painted on walls. clusters of forsaken houses, some already disappearing into the salty. Others, abandoned more recently, inhabited now by animals. Iron stripped away by thieves. Belongings not worth stealing. I'm surrounded, literally, by puzzle pieces. A mountain made from mud and straw, telephone poles and truck tires, and 100,000 gallons of paint. All of it built by one man, over 30 years. He still lives there, in an old trailer with no electricity or running water.
I spent 18 years maybe putting that big God is love out there, and 12 or 14 years building this.
Evidence of his labor is everywhere. So is this strange place a heaven? Or a hell? A tragic failure? Or a sort of post-apocalyptic wonderland? I guess it all depends on how you look at it. And in that way, at least, it's not so different from any place else. It's easy to look at a place like the Salton Sea and think, of course it failed. Of course it ended up that way. But when I look at it, I think, there but for the grace of God, go the rest of us.
Okay, just bringing the PowerPoint back up now. All right, is everyone looking at the PowerPoint again?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, and you're seeing a picture of a rusting trailer, right?
Yes, I can hear and I can see you. I can see the picture, brother.
Great, okay. Yeah, hoping that that short video clip gave you a sense of what I mean by the apocalyptic days, the music, the language, the sea turning on people, the sort of larger existential questions that are raised, the framing and the kind of lighting that's used. I think that's a really nice representative example of how this site tends to be viewed today in the pop culture media. So despite all of this, though, the state of California tries valiantly to manage in a way that can at least be educational for tourists who come to visit this post-apocalyptic ecosystem. The Interpretive Center has videos, infographics, and literature. Tourists understand what has happened in this place. It's an interesting type of ecotourism. I want to talk a bit about ecotourism in a general sense here, and then we can return to the Salton Sea. And what I'm going to do is just put some pictures up of the Salton Sea area to run, and they'll just change automatically for us while I continue reading my story to you. My reading of ecotourism, to which I owe much thanks to Brian Grimwood for helping me to develop, is that it's rife with ethical challenges. It frequently involves objectifying nature and holding it in contrast with culture as something pristine that must be preserved. The ecotourism industry benefits from this nature-culture binary and the sale of experiences with pure wilderness, often offering the moral argument to consumers. Taking part in such tourism is key to protecting these landscapes. Ecotourism is thus neoliberalism par excellence, as public goods are shifted to the private commodity system for stewardship. Okay, so I'm talking about the ethical challenges of ecotourism and how it frequently involves objectifying nature and holding it in contrast with culture as something pristine that must be preserved. The ecotourism industry benefits from this nature-culture binary and the sale of experiences with pure wilderness, often offering the moral argument to consumers that taking part in such tourism is key to protecting these landscapes. Ecotourism is thus neoliberalism par excellence, as public goods are shifted to the private commodity system for stewardship. With the destruction of ecosystems, however, the pristine product is slipping away. But capitalism is undeterred. Enter last chance tourism, wherein the industry capitalizes not only on nature, but specifically on its destruction as the Anthropocene progresses to pass it by. We can think of last chance tourism as any touristic activity that is specifically geared toward experiencing threatened species, naturescapes, built landscapes, or human cultural practices before they disappear. Robert Fletcher keenly identifies last chance tourism as a form of what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism, wherein capitalism manages to capture crises it itself has created and then turn them into new opportunities for accumulation. In Klein's words, disaster capitalism involves orchestrated raids on the public sphere in the wake of catastrophic events, combined with the treatment of disasters as exciting marketing opportunities. In the case of ecotourism, this process allows capital to continue to wring profit from raw materials that are fast disappearing by instead selling their very disappearance as the product. The body is also not exempt from capitalism's disciplining power, as ecotourists purchase expensive gear, both materially and symbolically useful, to adequately equip themselves for their endeavor. Once properly attired, if they find themselves on a package tour, they are then choreographed, told where and when to sit, stand, look, walk, move, stay still, and so on, say Fletcher and Neves. They are also told which senses to use, how, and when. They are often told what to feel and when. Last chance tourism is morally dubious, a sort of blood sport spectatorship, a type of dark tourism in which tourists are not merely engaging with sufferings of the past, but rather watching actual distress unfolding in real time. To paraphrase Harvey Lemelin and his colleagues, it's a front row seat to ecocide. Sites of ecological destruction, like the Salton Sea, offer a different proposition. Viewed through the apocalyptic gaze, they are sites for which we have already missed our last gen. They're sites of too late tourism. I'm just going to quickly unshare and reshare because the PowerPoint doesn't seem to be moving forward on its own. So let me just share this version and then I will move it to full screen version. There we go. Now that should just roll and show you some pictures while I read to you. Fletcher's identification of ecotourism as an expression of neoliberalism, a disciplining of the body, and even a type of disaster capitalism is prescient but bleak. In many ways, it is a Frankfurt School-style argument, where commodification is a zero-sum game. Commodity culture is so total and so totally alienating to the humans operating within it that there's no, quote, possibility of an affective response to commodities able to challenge the socioeconomic system that created them. There is no, quote, aesthetic sphere independent of capital, which could potentially platform resistance. Fletcher and his co-author, Caton Neves, suggest this directly, arguing that what ecotourism sells most centrally is a particular affective state: excitement, satisfaction, peace, contentment, pleasure, and so forth, attached to the outdoor, generally wilderness experience it offers. So our very affect is co-opted for capitalist gain, existential level grip. If we've learned anything from Deleuze and Guattari's rhizomatic, though, it's that possibilities for resistance can strike out in unexpected ways. Human interaction with the more than human world is too complex an encounter to have entirely predictable outcomes in any instance. Even within a practice like ecotourism, that is so much a product of contemporary colonial and capitalist exploitation, there is a potential to overflow framings imposed on or inherent within these encounters. As Deleuze and Guattari put it, there is always something that flows or flees, that escapes the overcoding machine. Tourism scholars are increasingly turning toward care ethics as a philosophical approach to guide ecotourism practice. But a deeper question can be asked about what feeds care by humans for the human world in the first place, and whether ecotourism might have a role to play in inspiring it. One answer to the question of what feeds care and other ethical meanings toward others, human and beyond, is enchantment. As Jane Bennett argues, ethics requires more than a moral code. It also requires an affective dimension that fills us up, opens our generosity, and moves us to act in good ways. Experiences of enchantment, she contends, are important pathways to our better selves. People have long seen the modern world as disenchanted. Weber was famous for this sentiment, lamenting in 1917 that the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world. Long before, of course, Nietzsche had observed that God was dead, meaning that religion had lost its grip as an overall organizer of life meaning and guarantor of ontological security, or what it is and means to be human. In the aftermath, many humans have been left to seek in alternative directions the many functions, which, as Nietzsche observed, religion used to provide: mystery, wonder, order, and purpose, a significance of objects and events, the the possibility of redemption, the sense of the infinite, the sacred in miracles, and epiphanies, to quote Joshua Landy and Michael Saylor, moments of being in which, for a brief instant, the center appears to hold, and the promise is held out of union with something bigger than oneself. Whether we have done that more or less successfully is a matter of debate. Both Bennett and Landy and Saylor make a strong case that reenchantment is not only possible, but happening all around us in small ways. They even assert the danger of denying this pattern, suggesting that viewing the world as disenchanted is at best a misreading of modernity, and at worst a form of micropolitics that militates against hope. I don't at all doubt that there are many moments of enchantment in the contemporary human experience, but I still tend to be less optimistic. It's hard for me to ignore the onto-epistemic unfolding of modernity. Morris Berman and Erezin Kohak each offer a take on this process. Berman emphasizes the transition away from what he calls participating consciousness, or the idea that everything in the universe is alive and interrelated, and that we know the world through direct identification with it or immersion in its phenomena. While this was a long transition, dating back even to early Jewish theology and some branches of Greek philosophy, it picked up steam in Europe with the eclipsing of alchemy, which Berman cites as the last great example of participating consciousness, by the epistemology of the scientific revolution. Through this transition, the Western world entered a state of non-participating consciousness, still dominant today. The state of mind in which the knower or subject in here sees himself or herself or themselves as radically disparate from the objects they confront, which they see as being out there. In this view, the phenomena of the world remain the same, whether or not we're present to observe them, and knowledge is acquired by recognizing a distance between ourselves and nature. It's easy to see how this shift in thinking feeds a nature-culture binary. Like Berman, Kohak emphasizes the importance of dichotomous thinking to modern onto-epistemics, but concentrates more on the consequences for our ability to experience the world in a rich, direct, and embodied way. Separation of the knower from the object to be known sets us up to reduce the object to its parts, to abstract it into concepts that move increasingly further from our lived experience with it. In his explanation, and I'll read a long quote from Kohak here because I love the way that he expresses things. Western scientific thought and popular thought in its wake gradually substituted a theoretical nature construct for the nature of lived experience in the role of reality. Far more than we ourselves usually realize, when we make seemingly obvious assertions about nature, we are no longer speaking about the natural environment of our lived experience, the living purposive physis which humans can recognize as kin and which they can feel at home. Our statements are far more likely to refer to a highly sophisticated construct, say matter in motion, ordered by efficient causality, which is the counterpart of the method and purpose of the natural sciences, rather than an object of lived experience. Within such a construct, to be sure, there's no place for a moral subject, simply because that construct was not designed to deal with it. We are the poorer for this situation. And so unlike Bennett and Landy and Saylor, who focus on the ways enchantment is still alive and well among humanity, when I look at the world, I instead see a largely disenchanted place. I see a place where people struggle with connection, meaning, and purpose, and a sense of being at home in the world. I see a place where our disconnection from this home is so intense that we're destroying its ability to sustain life for many species, and where we are destroying beloved land, sky, and seascapes that give human life meaning. This is in no way to argue that moments of enchantment don't occur, that there is no hope for widespread reenchantment. Indeed, it's the opposite. It's to argue that widespread reenchantment can and must occur, but we're not there yet. We have to work for it. Like everyone else who works with the concept of enchantment, I'm of course not advocating simply turning the clock back to pre-Renaissance ways of thinking about the world, and I'm certainly not arguing for a wholesale rejection of scientific epistemology. Instead, I'm curious about what participating consciousness might look like here, on the other side of modernity, in the Anthropocene, the capital C, the carbon extracto C. How might a reenchantment of the world, 21st century style, ignite our desire and give us strength, courage, and inspiration to live relationally in careful and responsible ways in our Earth home? What might lived experiences of enchantment look like? Several key features of this experience have been theorized. The most often highlighted are deep sensory engagement, quiet, and an alternative experience of time. As noted above, Kohak has argued that our ways of knowing have, since at least the 17th century, moved away from direct lived experience with nature and toward abstract understandings of it. Conceptual ways of knowing have come to dominate visceral ones. This departure from the sensory in our understanding of nature is unhelpful in living a relational ethics. Sensory experiences cut through the abstraction. They allow us to be in the thick of things, in the mode Donna Haraway calls being with. They allow us to cultivate a kind of perception, quote, meticulous attentiveness to the singular specificity of things, in the words of Jane Bennett. In being with Earth others in concrete and sensorially attentive ways, we put ourselves in a position to be struck with awe at their specificity their irreplaceability. Enchantment often emerges in quiet. As Kohak expresses it, the stars do not insist. Even the glare of a white gas lantern or the reflective glow of neon will drown them out. Only where humans respect the night can they see the wonder of the starry heaven as the psalmist saw it. Contemporary life is full of noise. In his environmental memoir, The End of Night, Paul Bogart tells us that 2/3 of Europeans and North Americans no longer experience a real night. Writing from the United States, he notes that 8 out of 10 of his compatriots born today will never see the Milky Way. But moments of quiet are so important for giving us our bearings, helping us to locate ourselves as very small pieces of something potentially infinitely larger. Alain de Botton describes the quiet experience of being small in sublime places. His lesson, as Emily Thomas characterizes it, is that the universe is mightier than we are, that we are frail and temporary and must accept limitations on our will, bow to necessities greater than ourselves. Paradoxically, this enchantment with the sublime leaves us not discouraged, but inspired by that which goes beyond ourselves. Enchantment opens a different sense of time. We're used to time either as highly personal or highly abstract. We live by the clock, an abstraction of the diurnal cycle that strains credibility, particularly for someone like me living at 50 degrees north, where we routinely get our sunsets anywhere from 4 to 10 p.m., depending on the month. And yet we live in time subjectively. My last visit to see Anna Maria Munar in the Mediterranean went by in a heartbeat. I've been giving this talk forever. You probably think so too. But there's a third.
I think we might have lost Kellee again. I think it's at her end, whatever problems we have, unfortunately, because it started with a sound and now it's not very good, yeah? Is it?
I was reading you a quote from Kohak, and so I'm just going to start that quote again. He's talking about time and how there's a third sense of time that's neither abstract nor subjective. It has all the hardness of the real, a logic of its own, the rhythm of vigor and fatigue, of day and night, the cycle of the seasons, and the life of nature and humans alike. Its stages, though personal, are not in the least arbitrary. Primordially, human experience simply is not a sequence of discrete events which need to be ordered by a clock and a calendar or by free association within a stream of consciousness, a la Proust or Joyce. It is rather set within the matrix of nature's rhythm, which establishes personal yet non-arbitrary reference points. When I have rested, when I grow weary, when the shadows lengthen, when life draws to a close. Though we may speak that way, it is simply not the case that at 6 o'clock, certain events will occur. The shadows will lengthen, my axe will grow heavy in my hands. Stopping the clock does not stop the event. The primordial time reference is the opposite. It is the experience of the evening, lodged in the shadows about me and in the weariness of my arms, which is the primordial given. Only secondarily do we designate it by a clock reference or acknowledge it in an internal time consciousness. Leaning into one's place in this rhythm facilitates presence, and being present is fundamental for living well with others. As Donna Haraway calls it, for staying with the trouble. She calls us to take our place, not as a vanishing pivot between awful or Edenic pasts and apocalyptic or salvific futures, but as fully present with all those beings and earth processes with which we are already entangled, but so easily forget to attend to. And there is also a fourth sense of time, where Kohak describes it, eternity intersects with earthly time. Kohak describes exploring the cellar hole of an old farmhouse near the cabin where he has retreated to live in a forest clearing. A wall buckles under him to reveal a file that had long ago fallen through a crack in the wall. His thoughts turn immediately to the owner of the file, and he imagines how the owner must have been searching for it, must have been frustrated that he had just had it in his hands only moments ago. Where had it gone? He found himself desperately hoping that the file's owner had not taken out his anger in losing the file on those around him, as we so often do to those closest to us. Some pieces of us live on in our artifacts and in the way others can wonder about us. Then Kohak imagines the man saying to his wife, "I will love you forever," an incredibly audacious statement, Kohak acknowledges, for a being who dwells in ever-flowing time. Yet he said it. There is truth in eternal time, in legacy, and in the infinite expanse of a present moment. This is what Haraway means when she talks of mourning as part of staying with the trouble. Lost species are remembered in the imprints they have left on others. For example, orchids that formed their flowers to match the anatomy of bees, now long gone. I just want to flip forward here and show you this cartoon that Donna Haraway uses in Staying with the Trouble. Here we go. We have this pair of friends who are walking in the woods, and the friend is explaining, these are the orchids whose flowers look like female bees. When males try to mate with them, they transfer pollen. This orchid makes flowers, but no bees land on them because the bee it mimics went extinct long ago. Without its partner, the orchid has resorted to self-pollinating, a last-ditch genetic strategy that only delays the inevitable. Nothing of the bee remains, but we know it existed from the shape of the flower. It's an idea of what the female bee looked like to the male bee as interpreted by a plant. And so her friend says, wow, so the only memory of a bee is a painting by a dying flower. And then he goes back to visit the flower and says, I'll remember your bee, orchid. I'll remember you. I think we're about here. Enchanted by the specificity and irreplaceability of things we observe to have been lost, we too can keep their memory alive. Moments of enchantment slip the overcoding machine. They turn us back to direct experience, to the expansive present, to a state of attentiveness wherein we can marvel at the specificity and integrity of all things and find our place among them. Moments of embodied sensory encounter break down abstract dualisms, bring mind back into body, bring body back into the earth as home. The nature-culture binary that is so often reinforced through ecotourism suggests that humans are independent of others, even made of a different stuff, civilizational stuff, not the wild stuff of nature. Much like liberal theories of morality, the assumption is that we are free agents, negotiating our rights and responsibilities with others from the standpoint of individualism. But there is no self-made being, no such thing as autopoiesis, wherein beings organize themselves and progress through life on their own work and merit. There is only sympoiesis, making with, where, to quote Donna Haraway, critters interpenetrate one another, get indigestion, and partially digest and partially assimilate one another, and thereby establish symbiotic arrangements that are otherwise known as cells, organisms, and ecological assemblages. We are all made of the same stuff, and our relations precede us. There is so much interest in care ethics and tourism studies right now, and that's because this philosophical perspective takes relationality as fundamental. But we need energy to exist in entanglement-caring ways, to practice care within the relationships that move us and invite us in. Living and dying together isn't easy. Care is an action, not only a sentiment, and we need resources to support us as we work to live carefully. I believe it is possible for ecotourism to be such a resource. It must be, or else we have to accept the modifying and colonizing forces as totalizing and impervious. Perhaps rather than learning about or conserving nature, the value of ecotourism lies in its capacity to arouse our sensory engagements with the world. Perhaps rather than fostering the economic development needs of particular communities, the value of ecotourism lies in its capacity to bring us all, tourists, operators, destinations, and our more than human kin, into symbiotic relationships that may invigorate more compassionate, vibrant worlds. Enchantment can provide the spark that moves our desire to be good to one another. Insofar as ecotourism can provide such moments of enchantment, I believe there's still hope for it as a practice. But what more specifically about too late tourism, of ecological sites like the Salton Sea that are framed predominantly through the apocalyptic gaze? Indigenous climate scholars in the eco-humanities argue that the apocalyptic imaginary is part and parcel of what Potawatomi scholar Kyle White calls crisis epistemology, wherein colonial powers justify harmful actions through European settler perceptions of time. In settler time, environmental crisis is new and it is urgent. Indigenous peoples, however, have experienced massive ecosystem upheaval for half a millennium, and plenty of change before that, to which they had to be supremely well organized in order to adapt successfully. Considering everything that has happened in the past 500 years, Indigenous peoples already live in a post-apocalyptic world. The term Anthropocene is often critiqued as a misleading concept. It's not all of Anthropos that has engaged in practices that radically alter Earth's ecosystems at a scope and timescale worthy of a new distinction in geological time. Similarly, Indigenous climate scholars argue that colonial imaginaries of climate crisis as thrusting humanity to the brink of an apocalypse lead to the erasure of indigenous ecological experience. As White says, indigenous people, quote, do not tell our futures beginning from the position of concern with the Anthropocene as a hitherto unanticipated vision of human invention, which involves mass extinctions and the disappearance of certain ecosystems. For the colonial period already rendered comparable outcomes that cost indigenous peoples their reciprocal relationships with thousands of plants, animals, and ecosystems, most of which are not coming back. Apocalyptic crisis epistemologies also lead to the ignoring of helpful knowledge from people who have been living through intense environmental change for a long time now. Tourism scholars have also highlighted problems with the apocalyptic imaginary. Drawing on Walter Benjamin's notion of aura, Hazel Tucker and Eric Shelton argue that what I'm calling the apocalyptic gaze sets up a problematic aesthetic distance between the tourist and what they're viewing. Benjamin's concept of aura derives from his philosophy on the way people engage with works of art, which was rooted in his desire to understand how human relations with art change in an era when art can be easily and cheaply reproduced. He argued that original artworks generate an aura, a sense of magical power which has to do with the specificity of viewing a unique work in a particular time and space, a context that can never be replicated. Critical to the experience of aura is a sense of distance between the object and the viewer. Benjamin's focus was on the way the shift of society toward an industrial mode of production was changing artistic experience, as reproduction of artwork stripped them from their unique context and closed the distance between the work and the viewer where aura had dwelt. But Tucker and Shelton recruit Benjamin's idea of aura to explore how tourists engage with threatened or disappearing ecologies, built landscapes, or cultural practices. Taking last chance tourism as the example par excellence, they argue that framings of aesthetic distance are bound up in the sense of nostalgia this genre of tourism must inevitably create in order to capitalize on the economy of scarcity implied in the demise of the toured object. See the last one before it's gone forever and there's nothing you can do. Popular imagery and narration of the Salton Sea certainly deals in this aesthetic distance. It is an ecology in ruin. You wouldn't want to get too close. But its biological destruction has also pulled down the human civilization that once harnessed itself around the sea, leaving scenes of abandonment and decay that tourists can't resist. It signifies a landscape that cannot be recaptured in time and space, and there is something magical, something aura exuding about that unclosable distance that compels people to enter into it. And distance can become a problem when it comes to making relations with and taking responsibility for things outside the self. So there are some problems with the apocalyptic gaze. But too late tourism landscapes might do other things too, might have other potentials. In her analysis of post-apocalyptic landscapes in cinema, Evdokia Stephanopoulos draws on Andrew McMurray's theory of environments as possessing rhetorical power. McMurray argues that rhetoric has been too much imagined as a function exclusive to humanity, and that we tend to overlook the ways the more than human world can also exert rhetorical pressure. Stephanopoulos argues that in post-apocalyptic cinema, features of the more than human world sometimes become more than mere settings for narrative action. They become landscapes that fulfill a storytelling role in their own right, prompting the viewer's attention toward broader environments in which humans are only a small part and into which human destiny is seamlessly woven. As such, there is potential to move the viewer toward new forms of ecological consciousness. If landscapes can spur such growth on the screen, then how much greater the potential for growth in ecological consciousness in an immersive landscape experience? Recall in our discussion about enchantment, the importance of direct sensory experiences that cut through abstractions, and especially the role of quiet in facilitating our ability to perceive this sensory input. Apocalyptic landscapes generally possess this quiet, certainly the Salton Sea does. There is a sense that life has left, and one hears only the wind and the water lapping. The ground of bones crunches underfoot. One is brought into communion with what was once there through its absence. There is a realization that something must be mourned. And yet we are still there, still standing at the edge of the shore. Tomorrow came after all, and we have to figure out what to do with it. What if the day after that comes too? What if the joke's on us? Apocalyptic landscapes play with our sense of time. The Christian version of the apocalypse, as told in the book of Revelation, is the one that has transfused into pop culture, the story of high drama and doom that leaves the earth in ruins in the end times. But it is consistently observed in the literature on apocalypse that a major part of that original story has been left out. The biblical apocalypse drew even its very name from Greek roots, meaning an uncovering or a revealing. And the idea was not that it was the end of the world, but the end of this world, as we now know it, and the transition to a new order to come. In its leap to pop culture, apocalypse has lost this notion and tends to be concerned with endings, full stop. In this way, it is of a piece with much environmental and especially climate change rhetoric, which emphasizes catastrophe and envisions a future where planet Earth cannot sustain life. I'm not sure we're going to get off the hook then. To gaze upon an apocalyptic landscape innately implies that we're still here. We still have to get up the next morning. There's no walking away in a big ball of trumpets and fire from a place we failed to live relationally with, failed to live carefully in. The Salton Sea is particularly interesting in this regard because its entire current existence has occurred over only a slightly longer period than a healthy human life. We have watched it fill, feed humans and other animals, change the migratory patterns of birds, enchant humans with its strange geography of a jewel in the desert, observe fantasies of escape and play, evaporate, poison, die, and now sit there wondering what's next. It's like a time-lapse nature film, from Eden to apocalypse, but the camera is still running. My hope for too late tourism is that when we stand toe-to-toe with apocalyptic landscapes, we will start to see beginnings instead of ends. The indigenous futurist artist Skawanati retells the Haudenosaunee creation story of the fall of Sky Woman in her beautiful and provocative computer-generated machinima, which is like a machine cinema, short film, She Falls for Ages. In the traditional story, Sky Woman falls through a hole to the watery earth below, where a series of helpful animals rescue her by helping her to land on a sea turtle's back and then bringing up dirt from the floor of the sea for her to plant seeds in from the sky world, a process which ultimately creates the earth as we know it. In Skawanati's sci-fi version, the part of Sky Woman is enacted by a young girl, Utitsagaya, who has special powers as a telepath. As she grows and learns to use her powers, she and her partner, who is the carekeeper of the celestial tree that gives life and health to the people, receive a vision that the tree is dying. Knowing that her world must pass away and that a new one must be built, the pregnant Otitsagayan volunteers to leap through the hole in the sky to carry seeds to create a new future for her people. Her fall is not an accident, plunging her from a greater world to a lesser one, but a choice, a leap of faith that new things can be made as older ones decay. Skawanati's moving film is an excellent example of how Indigenous climate studies scholars teach us that our current climate crisis isn't the end of the world, only the end of the world as we know it, from a dominant colonial, resource extractive, global capitalist present. To return to Kyle White's work, we can carry on advancing crisis epistemology, or we can begin to move toward what he calls epistemologies of coordination, wherein we enter into knowledge of the world through kin relations. Such relations are characterized by moral bonds of shared responsibility. White argues that the Indigenous worldview is of a world that is dynamic, not static, and that what matters is building the capacity to respond to change through ongoing renewal of moral bonds with others. Apocalyptic landscapes like the Salton Sea give us quiet places to contemplate the bonds we have failed to protect. They give us places to mourn what is past, but maybe more importantly, they give us places to do the work of what Vanessa Andreotti and her colleagues call hospicing. White quotes their description of this idea. Hospicing entails, quote, sitting with a system in decline, learning from its history, offering palliative care, seeing oneself in that which is dying, attending to the integrity of the process, dealing with tantrums, incontinence, anger, and helplessness, cleaning up, and clearing the space for something new. This, the authors note, is unlikely to be a glamorous process. Indeed, there's nothing glamorous about the Salton Sea anymore. The stench, the neurotoxic dog killer algae, the empty lots, the busted trailer homes dissolving in the desert heat, dead fish, dead birds, toxic dust, soaring asthma rates, the promise of lithium at the south end, already attracting mining operations to feed a new battery-powered post-carbon energy future. But the Salton Sea still has gifts for us. Maybe the strangest gift of encountering an apocalyptic landscape like this one is that, so paradoxically, it keeps us from running away from questions about the future. It gazes back at us, as if seemingly to pose the simple question, what's next? Thank you.